Welcome to Puddlecast, where we discuss safety, water, environment, and career development topics. Let's jump in.
Okay, in today's Catch Basin podcast, we're going to cover a recent decision made by the Supreme Court in a case of the city and county of San Francisco versus the EPA. And this has been a case that has its background with the city and the county of San Francisco having a CSO and having an NPDES permit that is controlling and managing the stormwater management on the landscape, and yet managing it under a municipal stormwater permit, they're still seeing exceedances of effluent limits and criteria that the EPA is then fining San Francisco to because they're not improving the water quality or because they're in excess. And the argument is really about, does the permit create this shield that as long as you're following the permit criteria, that you should be able to not violate water quality because the permit should have controls in place or should communicate to the permittee that they are protective of water quality as long as they follow the criteria. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read some of the excerpts that come out of this court ruling, and then we're gonna talk about sort of how those might influence other permittees, or how this might influence the industry moving forward. So just again, a little bit of background. The case involved a challenge to the quote unquote end result requirements, permit provisions that do not spell out what the permittee must do or refrain from doing, but instead make a permittee responsible for the quality of the water in the body of water to which the permittee discharges pollutants. So in other words, there's sort of this argument of, our narrative, if you don't have performance standards that you have to achieve because your permit is narrative, which out of all the stormwater permits that we have, construction, industrial, municipal, the municipal permit has been very much programmatic. It has not been performance-based like an industrial permit where folks are taking samples of things and demonstrating through the sampling process whether or not they're achieving permit compliance with the benchmarks that have been established for the permit. So it's interesting that this is now calling out that narrative approach, or that presumptive approach with a programmatic permit that doesn't have end of goal requirements that need to be achieved. If the permittee is managing all those narrative permits and they have a program, and yet they're not changing the water quality, the question then becomes, is that permittee liable because the water body itself is degrading? So the question becomes, can a permittee be held responsible for water quality at the end of the pipe to which they discharge to? And there's another statement here: determining what steps a permittee must take to ensure water quality standards are met is the EPA's responsibility, and Congress has given it tools needed to make that determination. So what the court basically said is they ruled in favor of San Francisco, and they basically said you can't hold a permittee responsible for the water quality. And when this permit first came out, it was really about the narrative versus effluent limit discussion. Can permits use narrative language? And the court sort of said, well, narrative language is important and it's part of it, but there also has to be, it's not so much that the performance standard needs to be there, but EPA has to give permittees a direction to be in compliance. They have to help a permittee know what meeting water quality means in terms of performance standards. And that is a challenging statement. That is putting a lot of emphasis on the EPA, that the EPA and state governing authorities are going to have the necessary education, experience, pathways to define that. And according to the court says the EPA should do it. In fact, there's a very damning statement at the end of this thing, which I'll read going forward, but it's that there is a expectation that the regulatory agencies implement standards that require control measures, not simply mandating achievement of result. The limitation is necessary to meet an objective is most naturally understood to mean a provision that sets out actions that must be taken to achieve the objective. So the statement is that there needs to be regulatory agencies need to define a path for what meeting water quality means within this permit. So I'm just scrolling down here. I'll reiterate what I said with the language here. It says none of these so-called narrative requirements is at issue here. Instead, this case involves provisions that do not spell out what a permittee must do or refrain from doing. Rather, they make a permittee responsible for the quality of water in the body of water into which the permittee discharges pollutants. When a permit contains such requirements, a permittee that punctitiously, that's an awesome word, that punctitiously follows every specific requirement in its permit may nevertheless face crushing penalties if the quality of the water in its receiving water falls below the applicable standards. So again, it's like if you have these permit standards, we have to have a pathway of success. We have to define what success means for the water quality and allow people to apply adaptive management and do the terms within it. But it also, what I think is interesting about this is that this court case ruled in favor of San Francisco and said, you shouldn't be held to all these civil and criminal penalties as long as you're following all the criteria of the permit. But I'm not so sure that it didn't also open up the box of, okay, so that means that we're either going to be looking at large individual permits that are going to have very specific numeric thresholds that are going to define adaptive management for each permittee moving forward. It even says here, the EPA may itself determine what facilities should do to protect water quality, and the agency has ample tools to obtain whatever information it needs to make that determination. If the EPA does its work, our holding should have no adverse effect on water quality. In other words, this is really, again, a damning statement to regulatory agencies that say you can't just write permits in a box. You can't just say certain things and have these expectations without demonstrating that there's a path of success moving forward. And I'm just going to say this, that there are several cases right now of permits that are asking things of permittees that we don't have a very good solution for, that we don't have things like 6 ppdq. There's not a lot of laboratories that know how to process that yet. We're talking about PFAS and making sure that we take that out of water, and yet there's not a lot of methodology or instruction or support to say, okay, how are you going to take now the sample that's going from the surface into the ground, and how are you going to get it into a jar that's representative of stormwater and not representative of the dirt or groundwater or some subgrade contamination as we move forward. There are a lot of things that I think we do in the stormwater industry where we find a new pollutant of concern and we start to chase it and we start to put it into paper as a metric or as a performance standard that we need to try to achieve, but we don't. It takes a long time to have the BMPs and these protocols, and then you have some of these states and some of these entities that are trying to build sort of evaluation processes of BMPs that are on the market and how well they perform, and for manufacturers to go through these protocols, whether it be Washington's TAPE protocol or the national, what they're talking about, the National STEP program, or some of these other programs, or these evaluation systems. There's a cost for manufacturers to go through that process. It's a cost and a risk. And the risk is on the manufacturer to make sure that they're media and things are performing, but what are the standards that are being measured against? Somebody that built something in their garage to take it to the market for a certain purpose may be being evaluated in a market for something else that they weren't intended that their BMP was supposed to do, and it may show that BMP necessarily in the greatest light. So again, it's thinking about all of these statements that are in this ruling open up this great big discussion about how are we going to go from, do municipal permits need to go from a programmatic permit to more of a narrative or more of a performance-based, instead of just being narrative, have these type of programmatic elements. Do we need to have effluent limitations established on municipalities at outfalls that are going to receiving waters so that there's a performance standard being there? And I don't know that that was San Francisco's intent, but some of this language opens the door for that, is saying, okay, well, if you don't want to be held to an effluent limit, if you don't want to be held to a water quality standard, we may be asking you to do some monitoring to demonstrate that the narrative approach and demonstrating that the programmatic approach that you've implemented in your permit is actually being successful. There are other categories of this that are happening with municipalities as well, especially those that discharge to water bodies that have TMDLs. And those TMDLs are the health-based limit. And now some of those jurisdictions are having to prove that they're not putting any more than that a pollutant in that receiving water in any one day. And those numbers don't just happen overnight. There's something that have to be, science has got to support it, and there's the statements of what healthy needs to be and all that kind of stuff before it goes there. There's another statement here inside the opinion of the court says, under the NPDES system, permittees have a very strong incentive to comply with all permit terms. For one thing, the Clean Water Act gives the EPA a very big quote-unquote stick. Permittees that do not comply may be hit with enormous civil penalties and may face criminal prosecution for quote-unquote knowing or even quote-unquote negligent violations. At the same time, the Clean Water Act holds out an enticing quote-unquote carrot under what is known as the quote-unquote permit shield provision. Any entity that adheres to the terms of this permit is deemed to be compliant with the act. In other words, going back to this statement of, as long as you're doing what the permit says, it should be that you are protected under those permit criteria. But if water quality continues to degrade, then it's up to the EPA or it's up to the regulatory authority to find a path to improve water quality. It goes on to say it does not authorize EPA to impose NPDES permit requirements that condition permit holder compliance on whether receiving waters meet applicable water quality standards. So there's if the permit is issued, it doesn't authorize an agency to say, under this permit, you are going to change water quality. It should, in fact, identify that the permittee needs to do these things. It give them a pathway of success to know that they are meeting, that they are improving water quality. But it can't be to the permittee to change the water quality because there are so many other inputs that are going in there. It's just that, okay, if the water body needs to be healthy, we're going to write a permit that gives you a path that we believe, under all of our technical knowledge and because there are BMPs in the industry that we have imposed, that if you follow this permit, you are in fact in compliance with the Clean Water Act, even if the water quality doesn't change. It says, indeed, there may be occasions, such as multiple discharger situations we discussed below, when there is nothing a permittee can do to bring about a prompt correction. In other words, there are things that other inputs into the system that a permittee can't be held responsible for in meeting water quality standards, that not one individual permittee can do this, which is lending its whole discussion to, is the permitting system that we have in place right now effective at improving water quality? Do we need to consider a different permitting process where, the patchwork of permittees, where one industrial site has, spending all this money on a treatment system, but their neighbor doesn't even know that stormwater is one word. Are we collectively actually improving water quality, or is this entity doing all the work and this entity is sort of unwinding what was done with treatment moving forward? It says a permittee should do everything required by all the other permit terms. It should devise a careful plan for protecting water quality, and it could diligently implement that plan. But if in the end the quality of the water in its receiving waters dropped below the applicable water quality levels, it would face dire potential consequences. And so those statements, again, it's just saying there's under the way the EPA is looking at it, is like, even if you followed all the plans, the water quality could still be degrading. And the last piece of this, and I think this is the most damning statement of the whole thing, is it says this in the court's opinion: if the EPA does what the Clean Water Act demands, water quality would not suffer. This was a crazy, not crazy, but this is a very emphatic statement made about regulatory agencies making sure that when they write a permit, that when they put these things together, that they need to consider the permit language and performance standards of the permit language to achieve water quality outcomes. Now, the challenge with that, and the citizen groups and some other, and another, by the way, this was not like a landslide victory in the court. It was a 5-4 decision, so it wasn't overwhelmingly one way. And another judge essentially said this: if the agency must impose individualized conditions for each permittee, then it will be more difficult and more time-consuming for the agency to issue permits. And there's some truth to that. There is some truth to the fact that if these permits are to really be the mechanism by which water quality is protected and improved, that is going to take more. There's more of an impetus on regulatory agencies to define what quote unquote success or compliance means. And the struggle with that, especially in today's environment where agencies' budgets are being cut and all the rest of that stuff, I don't know that we're going to see those agencies be able to achieve this. Nor do I see in a lot of cases where some of these agencies have the capabilities or even the experience to be able to lend into identifying what treatment BMPs are available to them. So, and I'm not necessarily talking about the EPA, but I am talking about some state agencies where the revolving door that it seems to be in a lot of these state agencies, where folks are not staying for long periods of time, and you have a bunch of folks that come in, they may not have the science background or even the stormwater background to understand all what ACART means. ACART, all known, available, reasonable methods of control, treatment, and abatement. What tools are available in the toolbox to achieve that outcome? So I think it's important to consider there are some different state-based or nationally focused BMP evaluation programs that are out there. And I think those programs are meant to help define what best management practices can do and vet manufacturers' claims about how well they behave. But I think this court case also puts either more emphasis on those programs, that more funding needs to go into them so that they can expedite things faster, or the challenge with these programs is that they cost manufacturers a lot of money and they take a significant amount of time to go through. So in the light of that, in the light of trying to meet new performance standards and potentially with new pollutants of concern, there has to be an expedited way of getting best management practices into the marketplace to achieve the removal rates and to achieve the performance standards that are going to be required of new permit criteria or new pollutant criteria. So these systems that are being put in place that are either evaluation, they may be more important or they may be considered ineffective in terms of how long it takes them to process results or to come up with a program of implementing tools into the toolbox to achieve permit requirements. So we'll see if this kind of case and this type of emphasis affects those type of programs moving forward. I think this court case, the rulings of this court case open in a whole bunch of different discussions and criteria. One, are programmatic permits effective at improving water quality? That's sort of question number one. What mechanism are agencies going to utilize to define what compliance means in these permits? How are they going to build a system that defines performance standards? And how are they going to do that in any type of time frame that allows things to go forward? Permits last for the rules last for 5 years, and oftentimes these permits are sort of managed for 2 years, and then there's sort of a midterm sort of, this is where we think we're going in the next 2 years, and then they start drafting 16, 24 months before it gets released. That doesn't seem like enough time at this point to achieve where we're trying to go. And oftentimes in that short window, new shiny things pop up, like new pollutants of concern, and then we start writing policies and practices into permits that don't have a reality base in the field. They're not grounded in understanding what a permittee has to do to comply. And they say, okay, well, here's the rules and we'll figure it out and let's just go forward. I understand the need for wanting to improve water quality and address new pollutants of concern, but not in the sense that we're sacrificing or not understanding all the BMPs or how somebody's going to implement a BMP to achieve that outcome. So the ruling that we have here really, I believe, opens up a lot of discussions about the permit system. Can individual NPDES general permits collectively improve water quality, or do we need to look at that differently? And really, do we need to have much better defined compliance standards, defining what compliance means to permittees moving forward? So stay tuned. These discussions have happened in the past. They're not necessarily new discussions, but this court case, while San Francisco won this court case in terms of saying we have done our best and we've done what the permit asks, and therefore we shouldn't have civil penalties imposed on us because we did what the permit asks and we did it in compliance with the permit. It also sort of might have backfired a little bit in that, okay, well, if that's the case, then the permit isn't protective enough, and we're going to impose standards that you have to achieve in doing that. So we'll see where this goes. We'll just see how this lands. But again, this is an important court case. It's been out there for the last few years and finally got ruled on, and we'll just see how this affects our industry. Again, anytime you have questions, you're welcome to reach out to the Academy. If you want to discuss this more, start having a communication inside of our communities. There's the link to this court case is in the community page and on the CWT Training Academy site. So you're welcome to read it for yourself and make your own sort of interpretations. This is my interpretation of what this court case means. And you may have some, just like everybody, we all have sort of look at it through a different set of lenses. So happy to have those dialogues, and thanks for listening.
In today's episode, Nathan discussed the recent Supreme Court ruling on the EPA versus the City and County of San Francisco. The court ruled that as long as permittees follow the guidelines set forth in their permits, they cannot be held liable for worsening water quality, even if effluent limits are exceeded. The EPA must outline a clear path to compliance in their permits, not just set unattainable goals. Regulatory agencies have the tools to gather the necessary information, but the court acknowledged that curating permits for each facility can be a challenging and lengthy process. We also touched on how identifying new pollutants of concern takes time, which can eventually lead to new BMPs being developed to tackle these issues. Regulatory authorities must consider the practicalities of finding solutions before setting hard limits.
Thank you for listening to our podcast today. Remember, you can always engage with us in our communities or get info from our blog and resource library at cwtacademy.com. That's cwtacademy.com. Follow us on social media to get the latest information and see what our team of instructors are up to. We hope you tune into the next podcast where we will discuss more water, safety, environmental, and career development topics. Bye.